I'd like to introduce Mr. Chappell, and his capstone title is Losing It in Translation. He started his capstone project actually 2 years ago, was about. And he picked one movie, about 2 hours length of a movie, which is not, which has not translated yet. And he was so fascinated, and he started to download, and then he changed the digitized, and started to translate and put the caption, and that is also his hobby as well. And then he turned into a capstone, and it's very, very interesting. And so the portion that he's going to present today is only very tiny little things of his work, but I think it's very interesting work, so I hope you will enjoy. Oh, and then he's going to Japan as an exchange student for 1 year.
Well, the English title of my presentation is Losing It in Translation, and as Dr. Saito Abbott mentioned, this actually was started quite some time ago, but the title was inspired by an incident year and a half, 2 years ago almost, where me and a couple of friends spent basically 2 days doing nothing but subtitling an hour of video, one of which was a half-hour anime, and the other of which was a short movie put out by Evan Baker called Chinotsuki, or Blood Moon. And it's actually inspired me to do some of this research, because really translation is a maddening process. You really do, I mean, not only do you lose a lot in the meaning, but you lose a lot kind of up here trying to figure out how to say what you want to say. This is kind of an overview of my presentation. I wanted to start out with kind of an idea of what is translation, because it's been defined many different ways throughout the centuries, and it's been used for many different purposes. And so, it's kind of important to look at historically what the definition of translation is. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is so important to me, go back a little bit to some of my reasons, and then I'm just going to launch right into my research questions and my research. And I don't have a lot of time, and I tend to ramble, so I'm going to try to be very concise about all of this. Basically, my reasons for wanting to get involved in wanting to do this research is because I was involved with an anime fansub group. This is a group that takes movies, anime, Japanese comic books, things of that sort, digitizes them, and then puts English in where the Japanese used to be. Or in the case of like movies and videos, we'll put subtitles on it. And the fans take this really seriously. They put a lot of effort into the translations, but the translations aren't really intended for kind of a general American audience. They're intended for people who have the same appreciation for the material as we do. And so a lot of things aren't translated, and or else aren't translated in a way that's really appropriate for kind of a general audience. And in fact, when things are translated in a way that's appropriate for a general audience, it tends to draw some criticism from the fan groups. So I want to launch into what is translation. I have a couple of different authors here. Berman basically said that translation, I mean, this is a fairly literal one, that translation is expressing in another language, in another culture, using kind of the norms of that culture to express the original ideas and the original words. This is a reasonable translation, but this is a reasonable idea of what translation is, but there are some problems with it that I'm going to go into in just a minute. Lawrence Venuti in particular had a really strong criticism of that, in that his view is that traditionally translation has been used as a tool of assimilation, that you take the original ideas, you take them and you basically remove the idea that this was once foreign and you rewrite it with your own intelligibilities. And so you read it and you no longer know that, okay, this came from Japan, this came from Italy, this came from Russia. You no longer have that concept anymore because it's completely and utterly in your own language, in your own culture. And his idea is that you have to address that this came from somewhere else, and you have to write into it enough so that the reader takes cues that, oh, this used to be Russian, this used to be Japanese, so that you can recognize and kind of empathize with what's going on a little bit better. John Dryden didn't take so much of a cultural approach, but instead said that there are three basic forms of translation, one of which isn't really a form of translation at all, but he includes it because there are so many authors that have fallen into this trap, that you can either translate word for word, which in the case of poetry, and John Dryden was also a poet, doesn't work tremendously well because you lose the flow, you lose the sense of harmony that the original had. You can paraphrase, but then at that point, when it's something like poetry, you've lost the original author's words, you've lost the music of the original, and now you're playing it with, you're playing a different melody. Even though it conveys the same ideas, it doesn't convey the same feel necessarily. Particularly with poetry, he said that you have to be careful because you can often fall into the trap of no longer rewriting the original. You start falling into the point where you're imitating the original, where you're the writer now. And that's not the function of translation. You are, as a translator, your function is not to be an author. Your function is to convey the original author's words and thoughts. And so he had a critique that you have to be very, very careful when translating to avoid that trap. Interestingly enough, I found a quote from Octavio Paz, who was mentioned in the last presentation. He had a very interesting idea, and that is that all written works are translations. They're translations of the thought. That there's a language of thought that is really what you want to translate. You don't want to translate the words on the page because those are already a translation. You don't want to translate a translation. Instead, you want to get back at what was the original thoughts, what were the original ideas that are being translated when the author writes it onto the page, so that you can then write those words differently, but it comes from the same source. And so he has some. I thought that was a very interesting idea because it was a little bit of a departure from how John Dryden talks about it, from how Lawrence Venuti talks about translation. This background in particular is kind of interesting. This is from a story called The Tale of Genji, which is a Japanese story. I have the book in back here. But this slide is about why this is important to me. As a former member of the fan titling group that I mentioned earlier, I ran into just a lot of criticisms of commercial translations now, because really commercial translation from Japanese is becoming a really big business. It's hard to not notice. I mean, kids are playing with Yu-Gi-Oh cards all the time. Pokemon is a huge phenomenon. There are some things that crept up on us. Not everybody knows that today it's a little more socially acceptable to know that Transformers is in fact Japanese. But there are a lot of things that are being imported from Japan. I mean, Last Samurai. I mean, we imported all of the ideas used in that movie. And so it's becoming a really big business, and yet there's this lingering criticism that we're getting it wrong, especially by the fans who really should know this material well. And so that's what prompted my research, and I wanted to kind of quantify this a little bit more, so I decided that I was going to take a survey to figure out how many people kind of shared this view, because my own personal experience isn't really good enough for this purpose. Beyond that, just really quickly, I wanted to go back to one of the things that Lawrence Venuti said about translation. The way that some of the way that we do translation now tends to reinforce some stereotyping. In particular, our depictions of characters and our translations of them derive from our own pre-existing ideas about the cultures. And to translate accurately, you have to be culture neutral. And that was one of the criticisms that the fans in particular had, is that the translators are not culture neutral in the way that they're doing translation. So these are my research questions. I wanted to know, what are the problems that people see with commercial translations? I said just translation in general here, but commercial translations in particular. What are the source of these problems? So are they just perceptions? Are they real problems? How did they find out about these problems? And because people learn about them from different means. Not everybody can speak Japanese fluently. I certainly can't yet. I'm getting there, but it matters where you learn the information from, and how you obtain the knowledge that this is a problem. In particular, I wanted to conduct two studies, actually. The first is the fan survey, and the second is actually a survey on the translator side, because once I had these problems identified, I wanted to see, well, from the translator side, how are these addressed? Are there any special things that the translators do to try to make sure that these don't occur, or maybe they consciously decided that these should occur and that the fans are wrong. And so I wanted to kind of approach the issue from both sides. The fan survey asked for a lot of information. Much of it was just numeric. I wanted to know how many years people had been studying Japanese language, how many years people had been studying Japanese culture, how many of those years were academic, things of that sort, before really launching into the problems. The next thing I asked was how many things had they seen? What was their breadth of exposure to Japanese translated works? Cultural, whether it's literature, whether it's anime, whether they like to read Japanese novels, what have you. What kinds of things? And then what were the problems that they perceived? This is what I got back from my group. It was a group of 20 different people. Everybody had at least been exposed to anime. Only one of the people in the group had not been exposed to manga. And 90% of the group were anime fans. Considering this was sent to mailing lists of California anime clubs and Japanese culture clubs, so I wasn't really too surprised by this breakdown. I was a little bit disappointed that there were so few fans of Japanese TV dramas, novels, and literatures, although it seems that most everybody had heard of Iron Chef. So that was an interesting note. I got a lot of people mentioning Iron Chef. Nearly half of the people chose anime-inspired nicknames. 'Cause I asked, if I quoted you, what would you like to be quoted as? And I could identify almost half as anime-inspired. So that was kind of interesting. The other really interesting thing was the breakdown of how many years people had been studying and what they estimated their own skill to be in both the language and the culture. Because over on the low end, you had people mostly saying, okay, well, we don't really know anything. But then it very quickly blooms and then starts shrinking again. So you have this pattern of, after about a year or two, people are going, oh, I know everything about Japan. And then they study for a couple of more years and they're not so sure anymore. And so it was a really interesting pattern, especially in light of what's about to come up. And this character is Sumomo-chan. She's from a series called Chobits, and I'm going to use her to explain one of my points. The two main complaints about translated works from Japan were that names were westernized and that there were spelling and grammar mistakes. And people said that in particular spelling and grammar mistakes weren't so bad anymore, but that a few years ago it was really awful. The westernization was especially bad with names. This character's name, Sumomo-chan, it's not the hardest name in the world, but for an American speaker, it's not necessarily the easiest name in the world either. So they took a literal translation of her name as Plum. A lot of the fans didn't really like this, and it's a good illustration of what the fans want versus realistically what you need to translate things as in order for it to make sense for an American audience. In particular, the largest number of people who were saying that there were problems were first and second year Japanese students. So they've been studying a little bit, but not very much. The higher level students didn't seem to be as vocal. When doing the translator survey, I still have a gap here because I have 3 people that have this. None of them have gotten it back to me yet, and I'm about ready to start cutting heads off. But there were 5 groups on the translator survey side. I translated one of them. I asked one of our Japanese exchange students to help me with translating another. A friend of mine in Japan, who's been a translator for 36 years, translated one, and then I did another via computer to really compare from the translator side what the problems were. And I'm going to focus just really briefly on this friend of mine from Japan who's been a translator for 36 years, because we ended up with some really interesting things coming out of that. That's a little quiet. That last phrase is what I wanted everybody to hear, because there is literally no way to translate yoroshiku onegai shimasu or yoroshiku onegai itashimasu into English. It is more or less a strictly Japanese concept, and you have to understand how the Japanese relate to each other to understand that single phrase. And he came up with something that was an okay fit. Well, thank you very much for your kind help, but still that's a little interesting in English. And I'm running very, very low on time, so I'm going to be kind of quick. Some of the things that I thought were going to be problematic, he thought were very straightforward. And some of the translations that he used were a little bit odd in English, but everything made sense. The perception, the differences in what people thought were hard were really kind of astounding to me, because he understood everything perfectly from the Japanese side, of course, but translating it into English was probably the hardest part. And I'm wondering if I have time to play this clip. Okay. This is perhaps the most amusing clip from the entire movie, Ichigen-san.
しかしそんな僕をあの忌まわしい瞬間が時折襲うのだった。
Oh, you? Japanese kanji. Okay.
Robert speaks perfect English, incidentally.
Japanese food. Oishii. Delicious. You, sorry, ma'am. 忙しい。You American?
Coffee?
Oh, no. British.
あ、ティッシュペーパー。
No. わからんっちゃな。
何が違うんですか？
Okay. Robert obviously was playing the fool here. This is kind of problematic because of this little part right here. We don't normally say things like American coffee, obviously. But, this particular part I thought was actually very difficult to translate some of the nuances of, even though literally it was fairly easy to do. You all got at least part of the joke, obviously, and I'm extremely grateful that you guys did. I guess there were really two sources, in my opinion, from looking at this of some of the problems, particularly in the Fansub group where people were kind of experienced at speaking Japanese. And I'm going to be very, very brief if I can. John Dryden in particular addressed that the people who know the least either tend to complain the most or complain not at all. And the people who know the most tend to complain endlessly about things that your everyday person would never understand. So they'll nitpick about the grammar not being right, but if you do it the way that they want, only scholars will understand it. The other part was that as fans, we could hear particular words, but we couldn't understand the entire sentence or the compounds that the words were used in. So we were like, oh, that's got to be wrong, even though the translation was perfectly fine. Things like people complaining about Sumomo-chan, having her name translated, is another one of the major sources of contention. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that because I am out of time. And I thank you all for listening to me. In particular, I would like to thank Gus Leonard, the lab director, for his help and for all of the wonderful technology. Yoshiko Saito Abbott, who's been my instructor for many years, for her assistance. Tom Abbott, again, for his assistance. Renka Ota for helping with some of the translation. And I'm sure the dozens of people who have helped at various points who I just cannot, for the life of me, come up with names right now. Thank you all very much.
Good luck in Japan.
Thank you.
Difficulties in terms of body language or non-verbal communication.
That was one of the things that actually I've done some research on, but I wasn't able to include in here. I found an interesting article on women's body language in Japan, and there's apparently some huge variations. We as Westerners would perceive some of the women's body language as really odd, and in fact I have from time to time. But it's because there is so little kind of cross-pollination between most Western cultures in Japan, the body language, the nuances, the unspoken languages are extremely different, and in fact has been a great source of contention between East and West. The mic.